There are mornings that seem to begin as if the whole world is smiling, a high, clear sky, sunlight filtering through the expansive glass panels of JFK Airport, casting a warm glow that washes away the usual rush. The sounds of rolling suitcases blend with the sharp clicks of high heels on polished stone floors, each footstep contributing to the symphony of modern life. Amid this scene, Ariana Taylor, 17, and her 15-year-old brother Micah stepped into Gate 32 with quiet confidence, as if they belonged there. Both were neatly dressed, Ariana in a pearl-colored shift dress, paired with a charcoal gray cashmere coat, Micah in a crisp white shirt, black blazer, and tailored khakis. Each held a first-class ticket not by luck, but as the result of preparation, effort, and deep respect for a special occasion, their grandmother's 80th birthday in Atlanta. Ariana gently cradled a small gift box wrapped in metallic gold paper. Inside was an antique pendant engraved with her grandmother's name in Ariana's own handwriting, a gift of modest material value, but rich in meaning. The gate agent greeted them with a professional smile. A soft beep sounded as the scanner confirmed their tickets, and the boarding passes were handed back with a courteous wish. Have a pleasant flight. Neither Ariana nor Micah could have known that a seemingly small moment was about to unfold, one that would not only alter the course of this flight, but force an entire organization to reconsider how it operates and how it sees people. The jet bridge, that glass corridor connecting land to sky, was quiet and serene, ceiling lights casting an even glow like a path guiding the hopeful, the anxious, and at times, the fearful. But Ariana and Micah carried only joy to return home, to see family, to share a meaningful moment together. As they entered the first-class cabin, Ariana couldn't help but smile, not because of the luxury or the privilege, but because everything was unfolding just as it should. Cream-colored leather seats, soft overhead lighting creating a warm, intimate ambience. Background sounds like soft jazz, the rustle of newspapers, the gentle clinking of glass. It all made time feel suspended, boundaries erased. Ariana sat in seat 2A, her 6 centimeters heels just touching the thick carpet, while Micah settled into seat to be beside her. He glanced out the window, where the runway stretched endlessly. A luggage vehicle veered to one side, and ground crew exchanged hand signals. Ariana opened her purse and carefully zipped the ticket into a secure pocket. Micah adjusted the strap of his leather crossbody bag, his eyes scanning the stream of passengers still entering the cabin. The two siblings didn't speak much, but their calm expressions and relaxed postures said it all. They were composed, respectful, and exactly where they were supposed to be. A flight attendant passed by with a tray of warm towels, a subtle lemon scent diffusing into the air. Ariana smiled and thanked her, gently folding the towel over her hands. Everything seemed perfect, as if the world, at least on this flight, was peaceful and in harmony. And then, the click of high heels echoed from the rear of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but carried a peculiar energy, cold and commanding. A tall figure approached, posture rigid, uniform pressed so sharply it seemed cut by laser. This was Karen Wilson, the lead flight attendant. Known for her iron discipline on every flight she managed, Karen stopped in front of row 2. No greeting, no smile. Her eyes scanned from Ariana's neatly styled bun to Micah's refined glasses, then halted at the golden gift box in Ariana's hands. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" The question came not with curiosity, but with suspicion cloaked in a veneer of calmness. Ariana looked up, maintaining a polite smile, and offered the ticket. "We have first-class tickets. You're welcome to check." Karen took the ticket, staring at it intently as if searching for a flaw, an error, a justification for judgment. Without a word, she handed it back. Just a slight nod and 3 clipped words. "We'll see about that. No thank you." No clear acknowledgement, just a dangling assertion of authority. Ariana felt her smile stiffen. She gripped the box a little tighter, her fingers trembling slightly despite her composure. Micah said nothing, but his gaze sharpened. He understood all too well. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was judgment based on skin color, not seat numbers. And though the cabin remained quiet, passengers still reading newspapers, sipping coffee, or scrolling through their phones. Something had already cracked in the fragile peace of that morning. Something deeply wrong was on its way. The first-class cabin remained acoustically quiet, yet the silence had shifted like a still lake disturbed by a small stone, sending ripples outward from the center. And that stone, unmistakably, was the scrutinizing gaze of Karen Wilson. Ariana glanced at her brother. Micah's posture hadn't changed, his back straight, hands resting on his thighs, but she knew. She only had to look into his eyes. They no longer held the same calm from when they first entered the cabin. Now they were alert, guarded. It was the look of a boy learning how to become a man in a world that wasn't always fair. As for Ariana, she said nothing. She simply smoothed the hem of her dress and exhaled softly, as if to steady herself. Her mother had once taught her, sometimes, the way you hold your head high is the strongest form of resistance. But no matter how composed she was still just a 17-year-old girl sitting across from a woman whose power had been sewn into her uniform. Karen moved on, but her footsteps left behind the lingering sense of unfinished business. A few minutes later, the familiar sound returned, the low rumble of engines beneath the floor, the plane preparing to leave the gate. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the flight attendants began checking seat belts. A little boy in a row behind them squealed with excitement at the sight of another plane. Taxiing outside, Ariana leaned slightly toward Micah, about to whisper something, when sudden Karen returned. This time, there was no more probing gaze. She stood directly in front of their row, upright like an officer, lips pressed together, hands on her hips. Her voice sliced through the calm like a blade. "I need you to move to seats in the back." The entire cabin seemed to freeze for a moment. Karen hadn't raised her voice, but the way she spoke it was clearly a command. No explanation, no justification, just "I need." Micah looked up, his eyes steady as stone. "May I ask why?" he said, voice polite but firm. Karen narrowed her eyes, arms now crossed over her chest. "These seats are currently being held for other passengers. You need to move now to avoid causing disruption." Ariana tensed. Her voice remained soft, but her eyes were starting to fill. "We have first-class tickets. I showed you earlier." "Something feels off." Karen cut her off with a look that was cold as steel. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, young lady. I have the authority to reassign seats when necessary. If you don't comply, I will have to call security." That threat felt like a mirror held up to the heart of every passenger who had overheard. A woman in a nearby row turned her face away. A man in a suit adjusted his glasses but said nothing. They saw clearly what was happening, and just as clearly, they chose silence. Ariana felt her chest tighten. She had never been humiliated in public like this before. The birthday gift box still rested in her lap, once a symbol of family love, now feeling like a fragile shield against a looming abuse of power. Micah leaned slightly toward her, his voice low but steady. "We're not leaving unless the captain says so." Karen appeared provoked. She stared at them as if they'd committed a serious offense. "Then I'll call security," she snapped. And then, as if to assert dominance further, she turned to another nearby flight attendant. "These seats are under my management," she said loudly, pointing at their row. "No one has the right to question my orders in this cabin." The other flight attendant looked uncomfortable, bowing her head to avoid Ariana's eyes. The atmosphere now held no music, no faint scent of lemon from warm towels, only the simmering heat of two young people being forced to face a gaping hole of prejudice. Ariana trembled, not from fear, but from holding back tears. No one deserves to be treated this way, especially not when they've done nothing wrong. A few passengers began whispering. The murmurs were soft, but carried traces of unease. "They don't seem to have done anything wrong." "That flight attendant is going too far, isn't she?" Still, no one spoke aloud. Perhaps they were afraid. Didn't want to cause a senior. Maybe they were simply used to staying quiet. When someone else was being singled out, Ariana turned to Micah. Their eyes met. No words were needed. They understood that if they gave in now, they would lose something far more valuable than just their seats. They would lose their dignity. Karen stood firm, hands on her hips, her face expressionless and cold. And then, Ariana reached into her purse. She pulled out her phone, and not in panic, not in haste, Calmly, she scrolled through her contacts and pressed a number. One call. Just one, but it was the call that would change everything. Phone pressed to her ear. Ariana maintained an oddly calm posture. Amid the suffocating tension of the cabin, the image of a young girl sitting upright, gently holding her phone. Whispering softly into the screen, it appeared as a form of resistance that needed no shouting. Micah said nothing. He merely nodded when he met his sister's eyes. That nod was not just agreement, it was an affirmation. Now is the time, someone needs to see this. Toward the back of the cabin, Karen rolled her eyes. She didn't know who the call was for, nor did she care to ask. She believed that the authority she held inside the aircraft was absolute, at least in her mind. It was. But those who wield power without understanding its limits are often the ones who fail to notice when they've already crossed the line. Ariana didn't say much, just a few short sentences, soft and near-whispered, like a secret carried by air. I'm on flight 647, yes. Her name is Karen Wilson. She's forcing us to leave our first-class seats. Even though our tickets are valid. She paused, listening. On the other end of the line was a deep male voice, clear and composed. Not a stranger, it was her uncle, Christopher Taylor, the current chief executive officer of the very airline they were flying. A man rarely seen in the media, but within the company. The name Christopher was iconic, a leader known for his zero-tolerance stance on favoritism, discrimination, or injustice. Ariana ended the call in under a minute. No one heard what he said, but the look in her eyes as she returned the phone to her bag, that look made it clear. The storm had just been set in motion. Karen strode to the front, her heels striking sharply against the carpet. She stopped at the front row, tapped lightly on the intercom panel, and whispered something into it. Micah remained seated, but his hands had clenched, not from fear, from anger. Not just at Karen, but at the system that allowed people like her to operate unchecked. In the cabin, the silence no longer resembled peace. It had become a silent witness. The passengers were starting to sense the scent of injustice, even if they didn't yet know the full story. A little boy in seat 3C leaned toward his mother and whispered, "Mom, why is that lady mad at them?" "They didn't do anything wrong." The mother gently stroked his hair, offering no reply. Some questions, even adults aren't brave enough to answer in front of children. Just minutes later, Claire Moreno, a senior supervisory flight attendant, entered from the service galley. On her crisp white shirt was a sharp metal nameplate. In contrast to Karen, Claire moved with quiet grace, and her gaze met others with a rare kind of respect. She exchanged a brief glance with another crew member before approaching Ariana and Micah's row. "Hello, you two," Claire said with a slight bow, her tone calm and professional. "I'm Claire, the flight supervisor today. May I ask, has something happened here?" Micah answered succinctly and clearly, "We have first-class tickets, but Miss Karen has repeatedly asked us to move to the economy cabin," without giving a specific reason other than the seats are reserved for someone else. Ariana added, her voice still gentle but no longer hesitant, "We showed her our tickets twice. She threatened to call security if we didn't move." Claire nodded and gestured politely for them to wait, then stepped forward toward the front of the aircraft, where she accessed the internal communication panel linked to the ground operations and airline management. By this point, no one in the cabin was focused on newspapers or their morning coffee anymore. All eyes were beginning to turn to seats 2A, and to be not with apathy, but with genuine attention. An older man in a gray suit quietly folded his magazine and gave a slight nod in Ariana's direction. She nodded back, no smile, no words, just the unspoken solidarity between people who understood. Sometimes silence is also an act. And then the unexpected happened. A deep, composed voice echoed through the intercom, shattering the cabin tension with a short, calm announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please note, Flight 647 will temporarily pause its departure preparation. An internal operations review is currently underway. Please remain seated, and thank you for your cooperation." Karen, standing near the galley, froze. She had no idea what was happening, but the sudden hold wasn't part of the standard procedure. Seconds later, Claire returned, now accompanied by another crew member. In her hands was a tablet. already displaying passenger information sent directly from the central operations system. Claire spoke quietly to Karen, but the shift in tone was unmistakable from voice to posture. Everything had changed. Karen took a step back, lips pressed tightly together. She no longer raised her voice, no more pointing, no more demands. Ariana remained seated, her chest still tight, but her eyes now shifting from worry to resolve. Micah gently tapped her hand and whispered, "You did the right thing. They heard us." At the back of the cabin, Karen moved quickly toward the galley, eyes down, saying nothing. She collapsed into the flight attendant's jump seat, her hands gripping the edges. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead, even as the air conditioning hummed steadily overhead. No one had to say it aloud. A storm was brewing, and this time she wasn't the one in control. In the first-class cabin, the atmosphere no longer resembled the quiet luxury people often associate with leather seats, complimentary champagne, or lemon-scented towels. Instead, it felt like the stage of a play reaching its climax. Every eye was drawn to the center, where two silent black teenagers now shook the very foundation of an entire industry's power structure. Ariana leaned her head back against the seat, her gaze fixed forward yet unfocused. She could hear her heartbeat clearly, each thump like a ticking countdown, silent and resolute. Inside her, a swirl of anxiety, pride, and a quiet ache churned together. She didn't need to shout, because truth, when spoken through unwavering resolve, doesn't need volume to be heard. Micah sat beside her, hands clasped together, his sharp gaze fixed on the aisle, where Karen Wilson had just entered the service galley. He said nothing, but his expression carried a calm far beyond his 15 years. It wasn't the numbness of someone used to injustice, it was the stillness of someone who had chosen not to bow his head anymore. At the front galley, Claire Moreno spoke into her headset in a low tone. She was receiving direct instructions from airline operations. Updates scrolled across her tablet screen line by line, each line a warning bell to those who once believed that job titles could shield them from accountability. Then, a familiar voice echoed through the intercom, not with an apology or a delay announcement, but with a message that made the entire cabin hold its breath. "This is Christopher Taylor, Chief Executive Officer of the airline. We have received an urgent report concerning inappropriate conduct by a cabin crew member aboard Flight 647. Effective immediately. I am suspending Flight Attendant Karen Wilson from all cabin authority pending a formal investigation." The message lasted only seconds, but its effect was seismic. Karen, still seated near the back of the plane, jolted upright as if struck by lightning. Her eyes widened, staring at the speaker as though she couldn't believe what she had just heard. But Claire's steady approach, tablet in hand, confirmed everything. Claire stopped in front of Karen. Her voice was calm, neither accusatory nor sympathetic. "Ms. Wilson, as of this moment, your authority over cabin operations is suspended. You are requested to assume a standby crew position at the rear. All passenger interactions will be subject to independent review by the disciplinary board." Karen opened her mouth to object, but no words came. She knew that a direct order from Christopher Taylor was never trivial. She stepped back, shoulders stiffened to maintain posture, but her shaken eyes betrayed the collapse within. In seat 2A, Ariana tilted her head toward her brother. Micah gave a small nod. Uncle spoke. Ariana pressed her lips together, a rush of air escaping her chest as though the tension had finally been released. She didn't cry, but her eyes held something that adults often called restored faith after pain. Some passengers' silent moments earlier began to stir. A middle-aged man took out his phone and began filming Karen as she quietly gathered her belongings. An elderly woman seated just behind Ariana turned to them. Her eyes filled with sincere encouragement. She spoke softly, just loud enough for the siblings to hear. "You did the right thing. I'm proud of how composed you both stayed." Ariana bowed slightly in thanks, though her heart felt like it might burst, not from pain, but from the realization that they were not alone. At the front of the cabin, Claire stepped to the overhead microphone, now assuming Karen's former position. Her voice was gentle, but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely apologize for the incident that has just taken place. All first-class passengers are fully entitled to their rightful accommodations. Any misconduct from staff will be addressed transparently and with seriousness. The cabin remained silent, but this time, it wasn't indifference, it was respect. In the rear jump seat, Karen Wilson sat alone. Sweat soaked the lining of her collar. She stared down at her hands that once gestured to command, to assert control, to force submission. Now, they trembled. She was no longer in control of the cabin. She had become a symbol of misused power exposed midair, where even the smallest injustice is magnified by the pressure of accountability. Moments later, Christopher Taylor's voice returned over the intercom. Our airline will issue a formal statement within the next 24 hours regarding this incident. But first, I want to personally thank passengers Ariana and Micah Taylor for their composure, their civility, and their unshakable courage. No one clapped. It wasn't necessary. What had just happened had transcended a single act. It had become a quiet emblem of dignity and justice. Ariana turned to her brother. Her expression finally lightened, like a burden had been lifted. "Do you think they understand now?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Micah looked out the window, where the sunlight cast a soft glow across the tarmac. "Not yet, sis, but at least now, they've started to listen." Sunlight continued to stream quietly through the first-class windows, stretching across the floor like a golden velvet ribbon. But no one in the cabin noticed the light. All attention, all silence, all judgment were focused on one person, Karen Wilson. She sat motionless at the back of the cabin, next to the service galley door, where only the fold-down jump seat and a cold metal wall kept her company. The navy blue uniform that once symbolized control and authority now felt like a heavy cloak, burdened with shame. Sweat had soaked through the collar fabric, making it cling to her skin like a shackle she could no longer remove. In her hand was her name tag, Karen Wilson, senior cabin supervisor, a small piece of metal that once stood for reputation, for the career she'd built over more than a decade. Now, it lay quietly in her palm, cold as stone, a silent indictment. In row 2, Ariana and Micah remained in their seats. No one asked them to move. No one questioned their presence anymore. Every whisper in the cabin now came from other passengers, those who had once stayed on the sidelines, now quietly leaning toward justice. An elderly gentleman seated across the aisle, dressed elegantly in a wine-colored silk tie, lowered his newspaper and gently nodded toward Ariana. "Young lady, you taught us a lesson in grace and courage." "Thank you." Ariana offered a small, warm smile. She didn't speak, just placed her hand over the small gift box resting in her lap. The gift for her beloved grandmother waiting in Atlanta no longer felt like just a material token. It had become a symbol of integrity, of love untouched by prejudice or hate. Micah leaned toward his sister and whispered, "I didn't think a single phone call could shake an entire plane like this." Ariana nodded softly, her gaze steady, because it wasn't just a phone call, it was the voice of truth, finally heard. And it was true sometimes. A truth spoken at the right moment, by the right person, can shatter fortresses built on artificial power. At the front of the aircraft, Claire Moreno, the flight supervisor, was finishing her internal report on the incident. Her fingers glided across the tablet screen as line after line appeared precise, unemotional. But weighty. This wasn't just a report for HR. It was part of a cultural shift where incidents like this would no longer be brushed off as minor misunderstandings. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning a key entry: abused seat assignment authority without valid justification, used coercive language, failed to acknowledge valid ticket presentation. Claire exhaled quietly and pressed submit. In the cockpit, Captain Morgan Ellis had just received new instructions from ground control. A confidential file popped up on the secondary monitor, accompanied by an order: hold current position. Senior Ethics Officer en route. "Etta, 10 minutes. He glanced at his co-pilot, raising an eyebrow. "Looks like we're about to have a very important guest." 10 minutes later, a soft knock echoed on the aircraft's door. Claire moved to open it. Outside stood a man in a light gray suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. His gait was composed, his presence unmistakably authoritative. It was Richard Lancaster, Director of Training and Professional Ethics for the airline. Though rarely in the public eye, He was the highest-ranking figure overseeing behavioral standards and the moral compass of the entire flight attendant corps. He didn't speak much. After Claire escorted him into the first-class cabin, he gave Ariana and Micah a respectful nod, his gaze radiating genuine admiration. Before continuing toward Karen looked up, eyes unfocused. She didn't rise. Richard didn't wait for her to stand. He simply said one sentence, quiet but devastating. You're not suspended because you were wrong, you're suspended because you didn't know you were wrong. Ariana turned away, no longer watching. She felt no satisfaction. She didn't need to. Because people like Karen, those who live through control and imposed power, when forced to face themselves, often crumble from within more violently than any public judgment could ever inflict. Micah gently touched her hand, as if to say it was time to let go of the pain. But his eyes remained on the scene, and when Karen slowly removed her name tag, her hands trembling, and placed it in Richard's palm, everything became clear. That name tag was no longer a symbol of promotion. It was now evidence of a lesson. No one can represent a brand without understanding the worth of human dignity. Claire's voice returned, lowered but steady. Over the intercom, "We are preparing for takeoff. Please fasten your seat belts. Our journey to Atlanta is about to begin." The engines hummed to life again, this time, not under tension, but as a restored melody of order and trust. Ariana held Micah's hand tightly. The two of them turned toward the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to light up at the horizon. Some dawns arrive late, but when they come, they wash away every trace of darkness. The Boeing 787 lifted quietly off the ground, rising through a thin veil of clouds above JFK Airport. Inside the first-class cabin, the soft glow from the overhead lights reflected off the passengers' faces, creating a sensation of drifting, not just physically, but emotionally, carrying along all the unspoken weight that had yet to find words. Ariana turned toward the window, her eyes following the slow drift of white clouds. They floated like thoughts not yet formed, vague, weightless, yet pressing heavily against her chest. She hadn't spoken since takeoff, not because she had nothing to say, but because there was too much and none of it could be easily spoken. Beside her, Micah held the in-flight safety magazine he'd read dozens of times, using it as a shield to avoid eye contact. He was still young, still holding on to that instinct to protect his sister. Yet even he couldn't hide the feeling of being stripped bare, seen and dismissed simply for being who he was. Ariana shifted slightly and placed her hand over his. She didn't say a word, but that touch was a silent pact. "I'm still here. We're okay." In the rear of the plane, Karen Wilson sat hunched in the fold-down flight attendant seat by the service galley door. There were no passengers left for her to direct, no colleagues engaging in idle chatter. She was left with only one thing, her own silence. Her name tag had been taken, and although the airline uniform still clung to her shoulders, it no longer held weight in the eyes of those around her. It was like a theater curtain drawn back, revealing the emptiness behind the spotlight. She recalled Richard Lancaster's gaze, no scolding, yet it had made her shiver. "You weren't suspended because you were wrong. You were suspended because you didn't know you were wrong." That sentence repeated itself in her mind, not by choice, and impossible to silence. First class had returned to a stillness, but not the distant luxury one associates with expensive flights. It was a deeper quiet, a collective pause among passengers who had become witnesses to a moral reckoning. A woman in her 50s, dressed elegantly with a string of pearls around her neck, gently set her teacup down and turned to Ariana. "Young lady, you've given me much to think about. I used to believe that discrimination was something from textbooks, but today I saw it with my own eyes, and now my heart has to answer for itself." Ariana nodded slightly, her voice barely above a breath. "I used to think if I just tried hard, stayed polite, I wouldn't be dismissed. But today I learned sometimes silence has to be broken." That sentence like a whisper into the conscience of everyone listening, in the row behind them. A businessman closed his laptop. He sat still for a moment, eyes fixed on seats to A and to B. His expression held reflection, perhaps the first time he'd asked himself, "How many times have I stayed silent in the face of injustice?" Up front in the cockpit, Captain Morgan Ellis recorded the flight log. Alongside it was a special report from HQ confirming the incident had been logged for industry-wide training. A condensed version of the event would be shown in next year's professional ethics course. For all flight crew, this wasn't simple. This wasn't a minor incident. Back in the galley, Karen finally stood. She walked toward the lavatory, but stopped in front of the mirror. She looked at herself for a long time, not to fix her hair, not to wipe away sweat, just to look at the woman she once believed was strict because she was professional. But the truth was she had been cold because it had become her habit, because she believed the uniform granted her the right to judge others without question. Now, looking in the mirror, she saw something else, someone beginning again learning how to be a human before being an employee. Back in first class, Ariana reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook and pen. It was a travel journal she always brought along, a habit her mother had taught her. Write it down, sweetheart, so you'll remember how it really felt while it's still alive inside you. On the first page of this journey, she wrote, "They didn't scream. They didn't slam tables. They just sat still and let conscience speak for itself." Micah leaned in to read over her shoulder and grinned. "You should write a book. Call it How to Change the Airline Industry Without Leaving Your Seat." Ariana chuckled, her first real laugh since boarding. The soft chime of the intercom echoed overhead, signaling the plane's descent. Claire walked down the aisle, her gaze connecting gently with each passenger, pausing a little longer at row 2A and to B. She bent down slightly and spoke in a quiet tone. "Thank you both, not just for standing up for yourselves, but for helping us learn how to stand together." At 35,000 feet, as the plane tilted gently in preparation for landing, a strange yet powerful feeling swept through the cabin, a new kind of belief. Not everything had been fixed on this flight. Not every heart had changed immediately. But something had certainly happened. Silence was no longer a curtain to shield injustice. And two children, with nothing but quiet strength, had torn the first slit through the clouds. The aircraft touched down at Atlanta International Airport at exactly 4:17 p.m., 10 minutes ahead of schedule, but no one noticed that number, because what had transpired during the past 3 hours had far surpassed the scope of an ordinary journey. As the wheels hit the runway, the sound reverberated through the cabin floor like a wake-up bell, not just for the passengers, but for an entire system accustomed to silence. In first class, Ariana gripped her brother's hand tightly. She could feel every rushed breath in her chest. The flight had ended, but more importantly, so had the test they never asked for. Micah closed his eyes for a few seconds, as if needing to steady himself before stepping out of a space he never wanted to associate with the memory of discrimination. He knew, once they walked through that metal door, they would no longer be anonymous passengers as they were when they boarded. They hadn't chosen that, but the truth was, they had become a voice. At the rear of the cabin, Karen Wilson still sat frozen, staring straight into the back of the seat in front of her, as if willing herself to disappear. She knew no one would ask her to disembark first. On the contrary, all eyes were waiting to see how she would walk off the plane. Then came the soft ding. The cabin door opened. A gentle breeze from the jet bridge swept in, not strong enough to lift the heavy tension, but enough to signal the next act had begun. In the VIP Rival Lounge, Richard Lancaster, Director of Training and Professional Ethics, was already waiting with a senior HR team. In his hand was a printed copy of Karen Wilson's official suspension notice, approved by the executive board less than an hour after the in-flight call. What made this moment historic? It was the first time in the airline's history that a senior cabin crew member had been suspended mid-flight and formally received by corporate officials the moment the aircraft landed. No meeting, no written statement, just one clear message: conscience was no longer asleep. As passengers began to deplane, airport staff had been discreetly assigned to maintain order. But there was no chaos, just quiet attentiveness. The first to step out was an elderly woman with silver hair and sharp eyes. She turned back, placed a gentle hand on Ariana's shoulder, and said, "Don't ever lose the way you stood tall today. It's worth more than any title in this world." Ariana smiled, her gratitude shining in her eyes. Micah walked beside her, gripping the gift box for their grandmother like it held the memory of the entire flight. Inside it, when they reached the VIP lobby, A staff member approached. "Welcome, Ariana and Micah Taylor. Director Lancaster would like to meet with you privately to express his gratitude." Ariana was caught off guard. She hadn't expected this to escalate further, but her eyes did not waver. She nodded. Inside a modest but elegant conference room, Richard Lancaster stood as they entered. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at them, the kind of look a man gives when he sees hope in the generation he once merely dreamed of. "Thank you," he said, slowly, "not for speaking up, but for choosing to speak up the right way, in a world that shouts. It's quiet strength like yours that truly moves hearts." Micah bowed his head slightly. "A little shy," Ariana answered gently. "We just didn't want to lower our heads for something we didn't do wrong." Richard nodded. He handed Ariana a sealed envelope. Inside was an official letter of apology from the airline, along with a full refund for the flight and a lifetime platinum membership for both of them. Ariana accepted it, but didn't smile. She only asked, "Will real change happen, sir?" Richard exhaled a deep, weighted breath. "It starts here, and it won't stop here." At that same moment, in the airline's internal media department, an 18-second video clip began circulating. It captured the moment Karen raised her voice, Ariana's tense expression, and her quiet but firm words, "We have our seats, ma'am." A staff member had recorded it discreetly on their phone and posted it to an internal chat group, with the caption, "They deserve to be known for teaching us a lesson." Within 30 minutes, the clip had passed 100,000 shares across internal platforms. The airline's communications team scrambled to update its public response strategy, because this was no longer a private matter. It had become a symbol. Elsewhere in the airport, Karen Wilson was escorted to an administrative office, where she was asked to return all company property: badge, nameplate, communication device. She entered the sterile room in silence, removing each item as if stripping away the layers of a mask she once believed was professionalism. Once done, an HR officer handed her an envelope. "This is a request to submit your written explanation. Within 48 hours, the disciplinary board will decide the outcome." Karen said nothing. She stepped out into the hallway, passing portraits of the airline's model flight attendants. Among them, her photo was being taken down. A young employee whispered to a colleague, "She used to be the face of discipline. Now she's no one." Finished the sentence. They didn't need to. That evening, in a small home in Atlanta, Ariana and Micah sat with their grandmother. The gift box had been opened. Inside was an old pendant, restored and gleaming, a keepsake from her youth with their grandfather. Their grandmother smiled as she clasped it around her neck. "I always told people my grandkids were smart," she teased, "but today I can say they're brave, too." Ariana leaned her head on her grandmother's shoulder, letting quiet tears fall without needing a reason. Micah poured more tea, his voice as soft as breath. "We're home now." The next morning, as the sun rose gently behind the crimson maple trees of suburban Atlanta, the news had already ignited across every corner of social media. On Twitter, an 18-second clip titled "Teenagers Humiliated for Sitting in First Class, Then Humbled an Entire Airline" had surpassed 2.4 million views overnight. The footage was grainy, but Karen Wilson's voice, Ariana's calm presence, and Micah's unwavering gaze became the focus of a nationwide reckoning. Major news outlets CNN, MSNBC, ABC all opened their morning broadcasts with the same headline: Flight 647 incident sparks nationwide airline reform. Dominion Air leadership responds. At Dominion Air's headquarters, the atmosphere was more tense than it had ever been. Richard Lancaster sat in a high-level meeting with the communications team, legal counsel, and board representatives. On the large screen was a fresh headline from the New York Times, "Silence in the Skies, When Teens Taught Us How to Land with Dignity." The article didn't just recount the events, it delved into the roots of unconscious bias, the quiet devastation of outdated authority, and the urgent need for a human-centered cultural overhaul. Richard leaned back in his chair. He knew this wasn't about disciplining one employee anymore. This was the moment to redefine corporate values. Back at Ariana's house, the kitchen was filled with the warm scent of toast and peach jam. Their grandmother brewed tea while Micah sat quietly by the window, eyes fixed on his phone. "Sis," He called, "A classmate just sent me the video. It's going viral on Reddit and TikTok." Ariana stepped in with a glass of lemon water, frowning slightly. "What video?" Micah held up his phone. On screen was the moment the two siblings calmly refused to move from their first-class seats. Soft classical music played in the background, yet the emotional impact was thunderous. Below were thousands of comments. "I cried." The way they held onto their dignity was unforgettable. "I work in aviation. I'm ashamed this happened." My daughter asked, "Why were they asked to leave, Mom?" I had no answer. A lesson in courage, no yelling needed. Ariana stared at the screen silently, not out of pride, but because the truth long ignored was finally being seen with open hearts. That afternoon, Claire Moreno, the senior flight attendant who replaced Karen during the flight, received a message. "From HQ, you're invited to speak at our internal ethics panel. We want your perspective professionally and humanely." Claire sighed softly. She understood this was a quiet turning point. The company was starting to elevate those who truly embodied the core of the profession. Trust was now something to be earned, not assumed. Hours later, Dominion Air held an official press conference, streamed live across multiple platforms. Behind the podium was the company logo, now updated with a new tagline and smaller type. "Respect is not a courtesy, it's a standard." CEO Christopher Taylor stood beside Richard Lancaster and the HR director. His voice rang out steady, deliberate. "Laying the first stones of a new foundation, we offer a public apology to two of our young passengers, Ariana Taylor and Micah Taylor, for the discriminatory experience they endured. That behavior stands in direct contradiction to our core values: humanity, fairness, and dignity. Starting next week, all employees will undergo mandatory retraining in professional ethics. We are also establishing a rapid response committee to address and transparently resolve all reports of bias and misconduct." At home, Ariana and Micah watched the broadcast while their grandmother quietly refilled the teacups. The room fell silent when their names were spoken in a national address. Micah turned to his sister, a small smile playing on his lips. "You know, it's like we touched the wound of a broken system and forced it to start healing." Ariana didn't reply. She just smiled softly and kept watching. Immediately following the press conference, social media exploded. The hashtag Silent Strength became the top trend across the U.S. A new campaign, "Fly with Dignity," launched on change.org, calling for similar reforms in other airlines. High school students across the country wore shirts reading, "We all belong into A and to B." But amid the rising wave of attention, one person quietly stepped out of the spotlight. Karen Wilson, after submitting her personal statement, officially resigned from the aviation industry. In her letter to HR, she wrote, "I once believed I was enforcing the rules, but today I understand no rule is greater than humanity. I need to relearn how to see a person, not just their boarding pass." The letter was never made public, but Claire read it, and she shed a single tear, not out of pity for Karen, but because, perhaps for the first time, the woman had finally faced herself. As night fell, Ariana and Micah stepped out onto the porch, where the moonlight cast a silver glow across the magnolia trees. Ariana asked quietly, "Do you think we did the right thing?" Micah looked up toward the sky, his voice steady. "I think we didn't just do the right thing. We showed people you can stand up without stepping on anyone else." 3 days after Dominion Air's groundbreaking press conference, a special invitation landed in the inbox at Ariana Taylor's home. The sender, PBS National Television. The subject line was simple: "Invitation to appear on Voices That Matter featuring Ariana and Micah Taylor." Alongside it was a handwritten letter, the penmanship graceful yet resolute. "We don't just want to recount what happened on the flight. We want to tell the story of how you preserved dignity in the middle of a storm, and how quiet strength can shift an entire system." Ariana read it, then placed her hand over the letter and looked at Micah. "What do you think?" she asked, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Micah shrugged lightly, but his voice was firm. "Sis, this isn't just our story anymore. It's for people like us to know they're not alone." Just 3 days later, under the soft amber lights of the PBS Atlanta studio, Ariana and Micah stepped onto a modest stage for a closed recording session, set to air during prime time the following week. There was no roaring audience, no sweeping camera drones, no blinding flashes, just a space for honest conversation. The host, Loretta Daniels, a veteran journalist with a warm voice and an empathetic gaze, began with a deceptively simple but weighty question. If you had to name the moment when you realized this wasn't just personal anymore, when would it be? Ariana inhaled deeply. Then she answered. Slowly, it was when everyone in the cabin looked at us not like we were causing trouble, but as if they were seeing themselves. Micah continued, hands loosely clasped. That was the moment I knew our silence didn't make the cabin quieter. It made people listen harder. Loretta smiled, adjusting her microphone gently before moving to a more delicate topic. Were you angry, resentful? Even that woman, she was suspended, lost her position, possibly her entire career. The room grew still. Micah looked to his sister. Ariana didn't hesitate. We're not happy anyone lost their job. But if there are no consequences, no one learns anything. Yes, we were angry. But more important than being angry was not letting that anger turn us into people we didn't want to become. Micah nodded. I believe in accountability. But real accountability starts when someone admits they were wrong. Loretta bowed her head slightly, a quiet gesture of respect. The recording ended with a gentle round of applause from the crew, not loud, but deeply sincere. And when the episode aired that Sunday evening, a nation didn't just watch, it listened. Across the country, in a small cafe in Seattle, Karen Wilson sat alone. The wall-mounted screen was playing Voice Is That Matter. The young barista didn't pay much attention to the older woman tucked in the corner, her baseball cap pulled low. Karen looked up at the screen. Her heart tightened when she saw Micah calmly say, we don't need to shout to earn respect, but we must be strong enough not to bow before injustice. She gripped her coffee cup. Her hand trembled, not from outrage, but from the deep knowing that it was too late to redo that moment, yet never too late to change because of it. The next day, Dominion Air hosted a company-wide virtual summit attended by over 3,000 managers via Zoom. The theme, Respect Isn't a Feeling, It's a Standard. At the main auditorium in Chicago, Richard Lancaster stepped to the podium. Before hundreds, he opened with a question. Who here has ever made a decision based on assumption rather than evidence? Many hands went up. He nodded without judgment. That's common, he said. But it's precisely this kind of common that allows unconscious bias to exist like a shadow. Today, that shadow was exposed not by a protest, but by 2 first-class seats and 2 children who refused to move. The air seemed to pause. Ariana, after the interview, received an invitation to become an honorary ambassador for Dominion Air's new training program, alongside a panel of experts in emotional intelligence and cross-cultural communication. She didn't answer right away. That evening, she sat with her grandmother, watching the twinkle of golden lights in the backyard. The small gift box from the flight sat once again on the table. The vintage necklace still shimmered softly. Do you think I'm strong enough to speak for others now, Grandma? She asked. Her grandmother smiled, placing a hand on Ariana's shoulder. You don't have to speak for anyone, dear, just speak your truth. And if that helps others see themselves in it, then that's already a miracle. At headquarters, Richard signed the final decision. Karen Wilson's photo would be removed from the model crew gallery, but her personnel file would remain intact. He wrote beneath it, we do not erase those who cause harm. We change the reasons that allowed harm to exist in the first place. At Micah's school, the principal hosted an all-student assembly. Micah was invited to speak. He stood before hundreds of classmates. His hands shook slightly, but his voice was clear. I'm not a hero. I just didn't want to be taught that staying silent keeps you safe, because sometimes silence is the deepest wound. The room burst into applause, not because his words were fancy, but because the truth in them made everyone pause. Later that day, a small parcel arrived at Ariana's home. Inside was a handwritten note unsigned. I used to work with Karen. I never thought she'd be suspended. But after watching the program and reading about the 2 of you, I realize we have to stop pretending not to see. Thank you for refusing to bow. There was no name, but one final line, written in slanted script, read, if justice is a voice, you'd have taught me that it doesn't have to be loud, just clear. 1 week after the viral video of Ariana, and Micah shook social media. Dominion Air hosted a special ceremony at its Chicago headquarters. The invitation card read, "Inaugural Ceremony of the Fly with Dignity Program, a reform initiative for airline conduct honoring individuals who contributed to social change." There was no grand stage, no fireworks, no rousing music, only a graceful space, soft lighting, and the delicate breath of a piano melody. And at the front row, Ariana and Micah Taylor sat with their grandmother. The auditorium was filled to capacity: airline executives, veteran flight attendants, ethics experts in aviation, members of the press, and most notably, over 40 passengers from that fateful flight. They weren't just attending a ceremony, they were witnessing a milestone. Richard Lancaster stepped onto the podium. He didn't look at notes. He didn't glance at the teleprompter. He looked straight at the two siblings. "I used to believe that change in an organization begins with strategy, plans, and training. But today, I understand, sometimes, change begins with two seats, two people, one choice not to bow." Applause followed, not loud, but deep. The kind of applause not meant for performance, but for truth. Then, Dominion Air's CEO, Christopher Taylor, appeared with a small mahogany box in hand. He approached Ariana and Micah, smiling warmly. "This is a small gift from us, not as an apology, but as a recognition of your courage." Micah opened the box. Inside were two miniature first-class seat models, scaled at 1:10, with their names engraved at the base. Ariana Taylor's seat to A, Micah Taylor's seat to B. Ariana let out a soft smile, her fingers trembling as she traced the polished wood. She understood this wasn't just a keepsake. It was a mark of the moment when quiet justice prevailed. After the ceremony, Dominion Air announced concrete action plans. Every new employee would be required to complete a 40-hour course on ethical communication and unconscious bias. A fairness response committee would be established, with representatives from passengers, entry-level staff, and independent experts. A scholarship program titled the Taylor Resilience Fellowship would be launched, awarding full university tuition to students affected by racial or public discrimination. The hall grew still as the final policies were read aloud. No one had imagined that one flight attendant's unconscious bias could spark an entire system-wide reform. In a quiet corner of the room, Karen Wilson was present, no longer in uniform, no title, no spotlight. She had applied to attend as an observer, submitting a formal request with a handwritten letter of apology. At the end of the event, she quietly approached Ariana and Micah. She wore no sunglasses, made no attempt to hide. She stood before them, her eyes heavy but sincere. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to hear from you that you're okay." Ariana met her gaze not with anger, not with pity, but with the look of someone who has moved beyond. "We're okay," she said. "Not because you were wrong, but because we didn't let that wrong define who we are." Micah added, "You can start over, but it has to start with truth." Karen nodded quietly, then bowed her head, and for the first time in her life, she understood the value of listening over commanding. That evening, back home, Ariana sat at her desk. Beside her were the miniature first-class seat and the letter from the airline. She picked up her pen and began writing her essay for a humanities scholarship she had been pursuing. "The day I realized silence could change an entire system was the day I truly grew up. I didn't scream. I didn't pound the table. I just sat there and waited for truth to speak. And sometimes, truth only needs a steady gaze to be seen." From the next room, Micah called out, "Sis, are you gonna tell school about the interview tomorrow?" Ariana laughed softly. "No need. You know what? The people who need to know, they've already seen it." The next morning, a massive LED screen at Atlanta International Airport lit up with a new message: Dominion Air, fly with dignity. We don't just take you to your destination, we ensure you are respected along the way. Below it was an image of the two miniature seats, to A and to B. No names, no dramatic slogans, just one simple quote: "Respect is not optional, it's oxygen." At Micah's school, a teacher pinned the photo of those seats to the classroom bulletin board with a caption: "Our students aren't just learning how to take tests, they're learning how to live with integrity." At Ariana's home, her grandmother sat on the porch, knitting quietly, eyes fixed on the bright morning sky. She whispered, My girl, she didn't make a scene, but she made the whole sky stop and listen.